Capcom's decision to reinvent its flagship series Resident Evil with the fourth iteration in 2005 marked the end of the golden age of survival horror. It also set the precept of what action horror games were to become for the good part of a decade. Times were changing, and the old survival horror format had grown stale and repetitive. Consumers were rejecting horror in favour of fast-paced, multiplayer action games. Capcom knew that if Resident Evil was to remain relevant, it needed to evolve, which is exactly what happened. True survival horror was swiftly forgotten, buried in favour of the more lucrative survival action genre. It wasn't until half a decade later that indie developers saw the true potential of a first-person horror experience, and following the release of titles such as Amnesia: The Dark Descent, first-person horror games became the standard format for horror games in the industry. However, what these developers didn't realise at the time is that they were the pioneers of an entirely new subgenre of horror, completely independent from all that had come before. So what many people believed was the resurgence of survival horror was actually something unique: psychological horror. Many people and developers erroneously label any horror game as survival horror. Survival horror is a subgenre of the all-encompassing horror genre, exclusive to video games. For a game to fall within this category, it must display the necessary niche characteristics, themes, and game mechanics indicative of said subgenre. As such, it is not enough for a game to have scary, horror themes to be labelled a survival horror. The key, deal-making characteristics of a survival horror game are loosely based on the action-adventure genre, where early examples of horror games, such as Alone in the Dark, Clock Tower, and Resident Evil, drew their inspiration. For a game to be classed as survival horror, it must fulfill the following criteria. The protagonists must be underpowered, weak, or incapable in some capacity to defend themselves against hostiles. This can include a limited inventory, sparse weaponry, and moderate to severe character flaws. The option of fight or flight is crucial. Fight or flight is often overlooked in a lot of modern horror games. In some, weapons and ammunition are in abundance, so fleeing is rarely a viable option, as the player is capable of dispatching any hostile with ease. In others, the ability to fight is completely removed, making flight the only option. In survival horror, it is crucial that a game allow the player to defend themselves. In other words, the protagonist will do anything in order to survive, regardless as to their physical capabilities. Some form of defense and offense is required, though not enough to make the player feel 100% safe. Many games fail to get this balance right. A game with good balance is the 2002 remake of Resident Evil, as well as the more recent Resident Evil 2 remake. The player is given the ability to fight, but they are not overpowered. Sometimes it may be in the player's best interest to simply run away. Skill and inventory management are key to surviving these games, especially on the harder difficulties. The gameplay and perspective must be limiting and, to a certain extent, frustrating and tense for the player. The player must feel like they do not have complete control over the situation and are helpless. Isolation and a difficult, foreboding location are important too. Perspective is not limited to third person or first person, though gameplay must be indicative of adventure games. This includes puzzle solving, inventory management, fetch quests, exploration, and so forth. Classic survival horror games used fixed camera angles, which created a dissonance between the player, the character, and the actions on screen. It also limited the player's control and view, making it difficult to know what was lurking around the next corner. Modern survival horror tends to employ the first-person perspective instead, both to limit the player's view and to create a sense of immersion and realism. Both are acceptable. Resident Evil 7 is a good example of a true survival horror game that uses the first-person perspective, whereas a game like Amnesia would qualify as a psychological horror game instead. Perhaps the most obvious, a survival horror game must have an emphasis on horror, drawing inspiration from pre-existing genre tropes already established in other entertainment forms, such as books, films, and other video games. An imbalance towards action would not only nullify this point, but also the first point, that of vulnerability. On the other hand, too great a focus on horror, and the game may find itself relinquishing its crucial adventure game mechanics in favour of an interactive, haunted house experience, a walking simulator full of tedious jump scares. The game can follow any form of horror, space horror, gothic horror, and so on, as long as it is indeed horror. Note that there is a difference between something that is horror-themed and horror-focused. The pacing is typically slow, with an inclination towards environmental storytelling. Setting is also important, as is isolation, for creating a horror atmosphere. It goes without saying that multiplayer is a bad thing, unless it is optional. In summary, for a game to be survival horror, it must fulfill the gameplay requirements. Fight or flight is crucial, and there must be a balance between horror and action. Too much action and the game becomes an action horror. Too much horror and the game becomes a psychological horror. Though I am sure there are those that disagree with me, I believe gameplay is critical when determining the genre of a game. Though the horror genre is vast and what many consider scary is subjective, when it comes to video game genres, what determines a game's label is objective. Gameplay is the core fundamental distinction between a survival horror game, a pixel horror, an action horror, a psychological horror, and so forth. Though you can make subtle adjustments to said gameplay, if you strive too far, it becomes something else entirely. If you took Red Dead Redemption, a homage to classic spaghetti westerns, and had it set in space, it would cease to belong to the western genre. In a similar vein, if you removed the ability to explore the wilderness at your leisure, it would cease to belong to the open world sandbox genre. Gameplay, setting, and theme are all equally important when determining the genre of a game. In recent years, there's been a massive resurgence in true survival horror games, so there is clearly a strong desire for old school survival horror.